It is officially April. You know what that means, Broncos country? The NFL Draft is fast approaching, despite not having a first or second round pick. What might the Broncos do in round number 3? We begin all that conversation and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day you can get this podcast. Make sure you hit the subscribe or that follow button for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast so you never miss out on an episode as soon as it's made available. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host and my good friend, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. It's a big month here, Broncos country, as the NFL Draft is fast approaching. And while there's not a lot of excitement in the eyes of some in Broncos country because there's no first or second round pick, Denver's got some premium picks in round number 3 and could still do some damage. Sayre, my friend, they're in the process right now. The Broncos are. They're hosting top 30 visits. They're going through and bringing in potential candidates they have interest in, guys they've met with at the NFL Scouting Combine they want to see a little bit more of. And I tell you what, there's some interesting names, including a potential mega athlete that could fit the bill for maybe what Sean Payton envisioned for Taysom Hill previously. There's a lot to talk about today. Let's break it all down, my man.
I'm excited, Cody. You know me. I love the NFL Draft. I love the offseason. And I specifically love the mystery. You know, Cody, how much I love mock drafts. And I know a lot of you listening love mock drafts as well, just exploring those different scenarios, picturing these guys in orange and blue. And I love the intrigue of the visits, like the top 30 visit. Like, what does that even mean? It doesn't necessarily mean you're bringing in the top 30 guys on your draft board, although it could give you a hint as to some guys that maybe you're considering picking early on, right? Remember last year, the Broncos brought in Nick Bonito for a pre-draft top 30 visit. They brought in Greg Dulcich for a pre-draft top 30 visit. So it's not like you just, this is all smoke screens, right? A lot of times you do have interest in these guys. And a lot of times too, you're bringing in players that maybe you are considering with a late round pick, but a lot of times this is a bit of recruiting, isn't it? You see a lot of guys come in for top 30 visits that you really want to prioritize as undrafted guys. And I'm not saying that that's what this is here, but I love the names that we have. That Mike Kliss of 9 News in Denver, he reported a couple of names that the Broncos are bringing in for top 30 visits, and it includes a second team or a Division II All-American, not second team, first team Division II All-American, and the Paul Hornung Award winner at the Division I level, given to the most versatile player in college football. We're talking about wide receiver David Durden, and then we're talking about the literal jack of all trades here, Jack Colletto from Oregon State.
You mentioned Jack Colletto, Jack of all trades. The moment you talked about his name, I was thinking, okay, hey, the Jack of all trades. I had an opportunity to reach out to a kid that I grew up with in Oregon. He plays for Oregon State as we speak. He's a second-year guy there. I asked him about Jack Colletto, and he said, hey, stole the words from my mouth. He is the Jack of all trades. He said, no pun intended. He is a guy that can do anything, just completely versatile. And when we talk about RAS, relative athletic score, he's going to fit the bill essentially for what maybe George Payton or Sean Payton are looking for. If in fact they do decide to go the route of having a guy who could do a little bit of everything, tight end, receiver, fullback, quarterback, special teams ace, this is a guy who can do it all there. And as much as I'm an Oregon Ducks guy, I got to respect, especially what they bring forth there with the Beavers. They had a really good year this year, and obviously I'm rooting on, someone I grew up with a little bit. Got to watch him grow up, when I was a senior playing football, he was the coach's son, and he was young, throwing the football around with his guys. They won a state title for my alma mater. It was some good stuff there, but I like the idea that they're looking at everything, right? And I think everybody, when they look at a guy who can play a multitude of positions, right, everyone's saying, okay, could this be the next Taysom Hill? We know that Mike Kliss, our good friend, put a tweet out there suggesting, hey, this could be the next Taysom Hill type player. The Broncos take a look in. I think it's kind of interesting to maybe see how the big board falls out, right? Because as you mentioned, these top 30 visits don't necessarily mean that these are the top 30 players on the board. Considering that Denver doesn't have a first or second round pick, Sayre, do you feel like it may change the way that their board looks? Do you still think that they go through and grade guys round 1, round 2? Like, these are the top guys on their board, and I guess as they get picked, if Denver doesn't move into round 2 or round 1, that they start taking those names off the board? I mean, what is your opinion on it, being as a guy you've been around, you've written about the NFL draft for many, many years?
Well, I love the perspective that George Payton, the Broncos GM, actually had. He was asked this question by, I believe it was Phil Milani even. And I think that I never really thought about it until he said this, but I would like to share this philosophy. I know I'm not an NFL GM, but he said when he was asked this question, like, how do you approach it differently, being that you don't have a first or second round pick? And George Payton was like, well, you approach the draft as though you do have those picks. So they're making their boards, they're grading these guys as though they have those selections available. Not to say that they ultimately will, of course, but at the same time, let's say a guy you have a first round grade on dips into the 40s or the 50s even, at which point you could really say, hey, we do have the ammo to move up for this guy if we have a first round grade. And typically, this is something that people also need to remember. If you're not aware of this, like, it's very, very rare in the NFL draft for any team whatsoever. We know there's 32 first round picks. This year there's 31, right? It's very, very rare for any team to have a first round grade on a player beyond like the top. I know this sounds crazy, but like oftentimes beyond the top 20, maybe 25 picks at the most. Like, there's not many first round grades that are really given out. That's why we see so much chaos in the NFL draft of like, wow, I thought this guy was a surefire first round pick, when teams really don't have them graded that way, because a lot of these teams only have 15 to 20 first round grades on guys. And in a draft like this, maybe even less than that. So really, I would say for the Broncos perspective, it makes all the sense in the world to grade these guys as though you do have that first and second round pick to say, hey, we want to maybe move up for this guy right here. He could really help us out.
Think it's something to consider. Another name that was thrown out there as well, David Durden. He's a wide receiver out of West Florida, a multi-sport athlete, a guy who, was drafted into the MLB, was drafted by the Red Sox in 2017. Sean Payton did mention, right? Obviously, they brought in Tremont Smith, who he called an elite special teams player. He still even mentioned at the NFL annual meeting that the returner position's really unsettled at this point. So maybe Denver is looking for a guy who can be a return specialist, there as well. So that's another name to consider here. And I think as we go on here in the next couple of weeks leading up to the NFL draft, we'll find out a little bit more about some of these prospects. We'll get to know some of the more important names, and we start doing what we call third round Thursdays, where we do, because the Broncos only picks begin in the third round. We will go through and start a mock draft every Thursday to bring you everything that Denver has from their latest picks. We'll talk about it. We'll encourage you to send yours in as well. But what are the Broncos going to look at in the NFL draft? Are they going to draft based on need, or are they going to build their depth? That's a question that Sayre and I throw out to everybody in Broncos country. You'll get that on today's episode of the show. Real quick, let me tell you about Ultimate GM, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked on Broncos. And if you've ever wanted to become an NFL general manager, now you can put your skills to the test on a mobile app, especially with the NFL draft coming up. You get to draft players. You get to build a coaching staff, build your roster in free agency. You get to control every aspect of your organization. Can you build a dynasty? You get all of this in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. You can play on the go as you want and when you want to. And Locked On Broncos listeners, they get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using the promo Locked On in all caps in the game store. That's Locked On in all caps, so make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today.
Being that the Broncos don't have a first or second round pick in the 2023 NFL draft, are they going to be focusing on adding depth? Are they going to be looking towards 2024, keeping one eye on the future, drafting players that can help now, maybe in different phases, but looking at not necessarily immediate starters? I think it's a fair question to ask, Cody, as we move into this NFL draft season, like full time. We were in free agency mode there the month of March. I mean, I know there were mock drafts floating around at the same time, but hey, now it's April. Free agency, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth waves of free agency, it's all over now. Now we focus on the question of whether or not the Broncos, because we've talked about this before, and I think you and I share this philosophy that in round 3, 2024, you're not necessarily drafting guys to come in and start for you right away. But the Broncos situation is obviously unique. Just because they don't have a first or second round pick doesn't mean that these rookies can't start for them. But as we look to this class, the strengths of this group that's coming out of the college ranks, do you think, Cody, that the Broncos need to look towards starters for the future, guys that could be in the lineup, in the rotation this season, but probably more so looking at developmental guys that could start closer to 2024, if not even a year beyond that?
I think it's a fair question to ask, and I think with Sean Payton coming in, knowing George Payton's philosophy, it wouldn't surprise me. No, right? When you look at Georgia's 2021 class, look how many of those guys have started instantly. Now, granted, they had a lot of draft picks in that NFL draft. Last year's draft, a little bit different, in comparison to 2021. You have several guys who were starters or had starting, got to start a little bit in 2022. I think it just depends on where your roster is at, right, construction-wise. And I think for Denver specifically, I do think they need to address depth, right? And maybe one of these picks can be a guy that you initially bring in. You're like, okay, hey, this is a guy we feel like will be solid depth for us if he has to step in right away, but also is projected to maybe be a future starter, right? It's always about the journey, and I always look at guys like Wesley Woodyard, for example, right? A guy who was never, wasn't a starter on defense when his career began. He kind of made his hay on special teams, emerged into a starter, and then had a very, very good NFL career. Shout out to my man Woodrow. Missed that guy in Denver. But I think it's maybe finding guys like that you believe can make an impact. And look, I always think of it in this light too. Considering where Denver's at, most of the positions that they've had a need at, they've gone through and they've addressed it in the offensive line. At this point, it doesn't seem like they're going to add another center to the mix. It seems like they're a little confident in Lloyd Cushenberry, and then they have a guy behind him who they brought in Kyle Fuller, and then you also have Luke Wattenberg as well. So there's 3 centers on your roster. So it kind of, in my opinion, takes that out of the equation for Denver. It doesn't hurt to look at maybe positions you're okay, hey, knowing that we're going to have vacancies at this position or impacted depth at this position after next year's free agency, things like that. Here's where we feel like if we get this guy, we put him in our system for about a year, 2 years, he can develop and he can be that guy. He can step in and be that starter, and it gives us more wiggle room to work with considering, Russell Wilson is still under contract. You're going to have to take care of some other guys in the near future like Patrick Surtain and other names there. It's about dominoes, right? What domino is going to fall first. And I think for George Payton, he is very in the present alongside Sean Payton, but also very forward thinking. I think you have to be in situations like that. So let me ask you, in terms of this, if Denver does look to address depth, Sayre, in your opinion, what positions do you feel like they need to invest in the NFL draft depth-wise this year?
Well, for anybody that's watching on YouTube, Cody, you just saw one of my dogs pop up behind me. I know the Broncos are going to be looking for prospects that got that dog in them, right? You want to see some guys that can come in like a Jack of all trades, Jack Colletto. You want to see guys that can come in, maybe even, I don't know, that's a lot to ask. Guys play multiple positions. I have a couple on my list, Cody, but after putting together the script, I want to start off my piece of this by going off the script. And I want to say offensive tackle. I think about losing Calvin Anderson, right? Your swing guy. You lost Cam Fleming, another swing offensive lineman who played a lot of tackle for you these last couple seasons. Look, that's 2 guys that play valuable snaps for you throughout the year. You need depth at the offensive tackle position, not to mention Garrett Bowles coming off that leg injury. Obviously, the Broncos don't have, I know they have Isaiah Prince. I know they signed a couple like Will Shields, or not Will Shields, somebody like that from Colorado
Will
last
Sherman,
year to futures deals. Will Sherman, excuse me. Will Shields, a really good offensive lineman, actually. But, you got these guys on the roster, but it's like, what have they actually done in the NFL to be quality depth? And obviously, a rookie hasn't done anything to be quality depth, but like we talked about, drafting guys to compete for starting jobs in 2024, you take a tackle in round 3, that guy's got to have starting potential, right? So I know my dogs are going crazy about it, Cody. They're having a blast underneath me right now. I don't know if you see my camera shaking, but hey, look, we got to roll with the punches on Locked On Broncos here. Shout out to anybody out there who's got a dog or multiple dogs like I do. But I think, Cody, for sure, the tackle position is one that I'm looking at this year.
I think it is important, right? Because you and I talked about this. That's the one area outside of addressing the starter position by adding Mike McGlinchey. You don't have anybody behind them. And the loss of Calvin, as you mentioned, that does loom a little bit larger here. I think linebacker will be a position they maybe need to take a look at, right? You have Josie Jewell. He's entering the last year on his contract as it stands. You did bring back Singleton, which is great. You do have Jonas Griffith, who you tendered as an ERFA, so that gives you some flexibility. Justin Sternad will be entering the last year of his deal after playing, the last few seasons. I know he's dealt with some injuries at the beginning part of it, but has become a key special teams guy for them. But then again, it's like this is a new coaching staff, and we'll see what kind of changes are about. You may have to look at bringing in a linebacker, even if it's an undrafted guy to come in and compete. We've seen the Broncos find some undrafted gems. I think that's a hat tip to their scouting and personnel department for identifying guys who maybe can come in and just in the right opportunity ball out. I think another position that you and I probably are in agreement with is defensive line. Look, you have DJ Jones, had some injuries last year for the Broncos. Mike Purcell, I believe, is entering the final back-end part of his contract with Denver. You need some beef on the defensive interior. You got Zach Allen at D-end. We don't know if it's going to be Inyoma Uwazurike or Matt Henningsen who's going to start at the other defensive end position, but I do feel like you need to add some bodies there, considering other guys in the past like McTelvin Agim, guys that we hoped would kind of maybe find their way, simply just couldn't find their way onto the field for Denver. I know there's still Jonathan Harris as an option, but you have to look at building out that depth there, and I think the NFL draft is a great way to do it because not only do you get them on rookie contracts, but if you find a guy who's just so strong, can anchor inside that A-gap, whether it be a 0, a 1, 2-eye, or even play the 3-tech, you're going to have, I think, a chess piece to move around other guys on the defense to put them in positions to succeed. To me, those would be positions I feel like Denver has to address there, Sayre.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, Cody. And I think also wide receiver and running back, the skill spots on offense. I think at wide receiver, here's the rationale there. Look, everybody at that position group essentially is on a 1-year deal. Not literally. I know nobody needs to go to spot track or over the cap and try to correct me on that. But I think given the situation with the trades, the trade rumors that have been going on with Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton, obviously Tim Patrick, I believe Cody is actually going into the last or second to last year of his deal. It's for sure the last year where the guaranteed money is on the table. KJ Hamler in the last year of his rookie deal. The wide receiver position, it may be reset after this year. It looks like they're going to keep it status quo for 2023, but I think you need to draft depth there. I think at running back as well, with Javonte Williams dealing with that injury, you bring in Samaje Perine, who's never really been a full-time back, and I think the Broncos are confident that he can be that, but I would still go draft somebody. I think the running back class this year looks as deep as any position group out there, so I think to me, those are two positions that you look at. Is you don't have a first or second round pick, take advantage of the position groups that are deep. I know Sean Payton has made a comment about the wide receiver position lacking depth, but we just got done talking in the first segment about a deep sleeper at that position that the Broncos are hosting a top 30 visit for. So maybe a little smoke screen there from Sean Payton. I'm looking at wide receiver and running back as two positions to add some depth and maybe looking to future starters as well.
Broncos country, let us know down below what positions that you feel the Denver Broncos need to address depth-wise in the NFL draft. Drop it in the YouTube comments down below, or you can tweet us on Twitter if you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. But we're going to continue the conversation. The Broncos have two quarterbacks on the roster, as is in terms of their starter and their backup. Could they add another guy in the NFL draft? There is a possibility they do just that. You'll get that on today's episode of the show real quick. You make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, and we appreciate you for it. We also have a show that we feel like you would really love here, and you should make them your second listen of the day. That is the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with the Draft Dudes. It's from free agency to the NFL Draft, salary cap management, and more. You can join NFL experts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino as they take you through what it's like to build a successful NFL franchise every Monday through Friday. You can find Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Could the Broncos add a quarterback in the 2023 NFL Draft despite having limited draft capital? It is an option that is on the table and shouldn't be taken off by anybody until proven otherwise. Thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much taking time to listen or to watch us break down all things orange and blue, the team that you root for every single Sunday. We have a podcast for you every single day, all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. Sayre, the conversation about quarterback, remember all the times, all the buildup that we had here, is Denver going to draft their quarterback of the future? We haven't had those conversations in the last year, even though that in the back of our head with Russ's struggles, that has been something that has popped up again as we thought the quarterback issue was solved. But Russ has a great opportunity this year to turn things around, to rewrite the narrative on what happened in 2022 initially. Could Denver maybe take a look at bringing in another quarterback? What are your thoughts on what they should do there? Because the NFL is also considering maybe an elevated status of a third quarterback, which is something I think is good that came out of the NFL annual meeting. It is something that has been tabled and will be reevaluated in May.
I think they need to do that. There's no doubt about it, especially with what we saw. You never wanted to get into a situation like the 49ers were in, right, with Brock Purdy getting injured. And obviously you have how many injuries that they had at the QB position. Yeah, it's a rare circumstance, I'm sure, if you look at the history of the league, right? But you don't want to be in the biggest game of the year, or one of the, the NFC championship game this year, Cody, between the Eagles and 49ers. If everyone's healthy, that may have been a better game overall than the Super Bowl was in terms of just the abilities of those two teams. But really, when you look at the way that this league is going, I don't see how you can not have this happen. We see teams every single year, including the Broncos, go through multiple quarterbacks, and you just have to be able to have that flexibility throughout the year. We know the Broncos right now obviously have Russell Wilson, you got Jarrett Stidham, and then you have Jarrett Guarantano, the quarterback 3 currently on the roster, who was signed last year to the practice squad and then got a 2-year deal to come be part of the team. So you have Guarantano there. I don't know what the teams, like the new coaching staff, what do they think about him? Brett Rippon still out there and available, but the team is, we talked about, I know the jack of all trades. He's not necessarily a quarterback by trade, but the Broncos have been looking at quarterbacks specifically. Penn State quarterback Sean Clifford did a Zoom interview with new quarterbacks coach Davis Webb. Cody, this guy, he took off his shirt and stripped himself down and ran a 4.57 at the Penn State Pro Day. I watched the video footage of it. The guy was moving. He was out there with a chip on his shoulder too. Didn't get invited to the combine. Very interesting though to start thinking about some of these late round quarterbacks, because we know Sean Payton, I think he's going to start putting his stamp. We saw it with Stidham already. I think he's going to continue putting his stamp on this position through the NFL draft, even with limited capital.
I feel like it would be irresponsible for Denver if they didn't look at quarterback prospects, right? Because I think you always have to have in the back of your head, like, okay, we have to always have an eye on the future while being involved in the present. Now, while Jarrett Stidham is here for 2 years, essentially, I mean, it's a 2-year deal, but it could be a 1-year deal if Denver wanted to move on after next season. The whole Russell thing, like they're hoping that he just comes in and he balls out. But if they also find a guy in the NFL draft, they're like, hey, you know what? This guy can develop in this system. We believe that we can build the system around him with our coaching staff, with the pieces that we have around, with the quarterback that we have that's starting in Russell Wilson. This is a young guy that can benefit from learning and maybe could grow into the role down the road eventually, because you never know what's going to happen. Not saying that the Broncos are going to go out and do this whole entire situation that kind of is replicated of what Green Bay did with Jordan Love. That was a wild anomaly, and we've seen how that's kind of played out. He'll get the chance to be their guy in Green Bay this upcoming year. But I think you always have to have an eye on the future. And look, worst case scenario, let's say Russ does perform not so good this season. Denver has a first-round pick in next year's NFL draft. They could always look at a quarterback then as well. So I think Denver's keeping their options open on these things. I think it's smart, it's responsible, and you know what? They may shock us. Like I think if they did one pick in the 3rd round, Sayre, at a position, I know this isn't on our script, but what would shock you? Like, to me, if they went quarterback with one of their 3rd round picks, I think I would genuinely be shocked. That would be the one pick or one position that I'm like, wait a minute, they did that? What are your thoughts?
I think that would be very shocking to see, especially because you signed Stidham, right? So going after a 3rd round QB, that would be, I'm here for that kind of chaos though, Cody. Look, you don't have a 1st or 2nd round pick. Do what you want with those 5 draft selections. Like, we're talking about adding depth. well, what position is more important to add depth to than the quarterback position, especially when you don't know what's going to happen this coming year with Russell Wilson. So I think, man, although that would be shocking, it would be a lot of fun. I'd be sitting back in my couch, Cody, watching the NFL draft unfold just with the utmost of intrigue. I'd be pulling open TweetDeck to see all the different things Broncos country would be saying at that point, because I think everybody's kind of got these ideas in their head at this point of like, okay, you address these needs in free agency. Clearly that means you're going to go this direction in the draft. And when you get your mind and heart fixated on that particular scenario, then you throw a quarterback into the mix and it's like, what are we doing? You know, what is like, then you'll start hearing people just totally bagging on Sean Payton and George Payton and things like, but there's no more important position to have depth at, right, than quarterback. And maybe this guy can contribute, whether it's, I don't know who you'd pick in round 3, but whoever ends up being there, maybe that player could be somebody like Taysom Hill. I'm not saying they're going to transition to the tight end position, but somebody who can come in there and just be like, hey, we need we talked about running back depth, right? Well, Taysom Hill, he took a lot of carries for that New Orleans Saints team, helped elevate their running game tremendously as well. So it's kind of an interesting wrinkle. Like I don't think Sean Payton is done surprising us. So hey, although it would be shocking to see him make a selection like that at that spot in round 3, maybe don't take that off the table at this point, Broncos country. So if you're listening to this, you're putting together your mock drafts, maybe see in those machines who's available in round 3, because you never know.
You never know, and that's the thing, too, about mock drafts. And, I think people know where I stand on them. I think it's a fun exercise, right? But it almost never predicates what's actually going to happen. And I think, round 1, it gives you ideas and opportunities. But with Denver not having a first-round pick, it makes it very, very difficult for the Broncos side of things for round 3. So with that said, though, Broncos country, we are excited for third round Thursdays where we do a mock draft, and it goes through because Denver's first picks start in round number 3. You'll get that in a couple of weeks building up to the NFL draft, where the Broncos will be on the clock at pick number 67. We are also going to open it up where you can send us your mock drafts as well. We'll share some of the best ones on Locked On Broncos going forward. Stay tuned on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos for the cues to submit your mock drafts as well. But with that said, Broncos country, that will wrap up today's episode of the show. The NFL Draft buildup continues for the Broncos organization, and one thing is for certain, Sayre Bedinger, myself, will have you covered every step of the way. Make sure you subscribe or you follow for free on YouTube or your favorite podcasting provider so you never miss out on an episode as soon as it's made available. We'll be back tomorrow for a brand new episode of the show.